introduce myself. So I'm Marcus Plested. I'm a professor of Greek, Patristic and Byzantine theology at Marquette University in Wisconsin, which is very snowy this morning. And our panelist today, the book we're going to be talking about, which I have here, is Tikhon Pino. Tikhon Pino is Assistant Director of the Papas Patristic Institute at Holy Cross Orthodox School of Theology in Brooklyn. He's a graduate of Marquette University for his PhD, and I had the great good fortune and honor being his director for his thesis, which eventually became the book Essence and Energies, Being and Naming God in St. Gregory Palamas. So I'm going to give a few minutes intro, then Dr. Pino is going to talk about his book, and then there'll be time for questions. And I think the idea is that people start putting their questions into the chat, well, more or less straight away. So we've got a few questions to get going with once we get to the end of Tikhon's portion of this session. So yes, this book, Essence and Energies, Being and Naming God in St. Gregory Palamas, is something that I myself learned a great deal from. It's a tremendous work, an impressive scholarly achievement that does something which hasn't been done before. In other words, produce a highly detailed reading of the idea of essence and energies in St. Gregory Palamas, based on the whole corpus of St. Gregory Palamas. Now, people often talk about St. Gregory Palamas drawing upon just one or two texts, you know, the triads, maybe the 150 chapters, but certainly not the whole corpus. And one of the great merits of this book, I think, is that it does draw upon the entire corpus of Palamas's works, perhaps with a particular focus on the works against Kindlenos. And it is revelatory, I would say, as a book in terms of what's actually going on in the essence and energies distinction. He makes an enormous contribution to understanding the distinction in the first place, and also gets rid of some canards, some misunderstandings that often circulate about the essence energies distinction. So it's a very detailed, trawl study of Palamas's teaching on essence energies. He really gets into, you know, what these terms mean for Palamas, the term essence, the term energies or activities or operations or actualizations, however one wants to describe this terminology. And as I say, I think it's unrivaled as a close study of essence and energies in St. Gregory Palamas. And some of the misconceptions he gets rid of include, but are not limited to, the idea that the essence energies distinction maps exactly onto the distinction between apophatic and cataphatic theology, or to the distinction between God in se, in himself, and God ad extra, God towards the world. He also points out that Palamas never uses the term real distinction, and you'd be amazed the number of times the term real distinction is circulated when talking about Palamas, as though he had a precise distinctio realis in the Latin sense. So it's a book that gives us great insight into this terminology, and also to Palamas's project more generally. I mean, yes, of course, Palamas is defending mystical experience. Of course, he's defending a robust understanding of human deification, but we don't see in Palamas a kind of easy contrast or dichotomy between mystical experience on the one hand and reasoned theological, philosophical argumentation on the other. On the contrary, Palamas is able to use the tradition, use certain philosophical ideas in order to defend a profoundly traditional notion. And I'm going to hand over to Tikhon now to talk about his book, and perhaps just once again congratulate him on what I think is a very impressive achievement. So over to you, Tikhon.
Thank you, Marcus, for that generous and humbling introduction. Yes, I had the pleasure of having Marcus as my director, and as Dr. Plested says, this book stems from my doctoral dissertation. You know, I've said this before, but I never really intended to set out to write on St. Gregory Palamas. This was not a subject that I thought going into my PhD that needed to be done yet again. I thought people had talked about St. Gregory Palamas quite a bit. The essence energies distinction had achieved a certain level of fame and attention. And I was very much interested in moving the conversation forward. And I was particularly inspired by John Dimitrakopoulos' sort of groundbreaking essay on Palamas Transformed and the reception of St. Gregory Palamas among later Byzantine theologians. We often talk about St. Gregory Palamas in isolation. And of course, he defended the essence energies distinction and elaborated it in an ecclesiastical context, in a collaborative polemical context. And so I had initially hoped to work on people like Philotheos Kokinos, Joseph Kalothetos, David Dissipatos, and all the way up to later figures like Simeon of Thessalonica and St. Mark of Ephesus. So it was a revelation to me when I started to read through St. Gregory Palamas in order to prepare a sort of initial chapter for the dissertation on Palamas and essence and energies before moving on to his sort of broader reception. It was a revelation to find out that there was so much detail and information on the essence energies distinction in St. Gregory's writings that had not been adequately cataloged and described and laid out. And so what was initially going to be one chapter turned into an entire monograph. St. Gregory's writings are on the essence energies distinction are contained in 5 volumes of the modern printed edition. And most of these, as Marcus pointed out, have not been mined for their exposition of the essence energies distinction. These are written over a 20-year period of Palamas's career. So there's a lot to account for. I think that the main payoff of the book is to answer or to address the question of what are energies? What is this language of energia? How does Palamas use it? What does he have in mind when he talks about energies? As I said, I did not think that this was something that needed to be touched on yet again. I very much wanted to move the conversation forward, but I was very surprised to find that there was still much that needed to be said about how Palamas uses this language, what he has in mind. So after laying out sort of a little bit of the history of the status questionis of how others have interpreted Palamas, how Palamas has been presented up to the modern day, there is a chapter on this question of the language of energies. And I think I can say without giving away too much that one of the payoffs of this work was that energies language is not simply activities language in the colloquial sense of the word. These are not just actions that God performs. So the Palamas uses the language of dynamis or power, the language of what we would think of as more scholastic language of attributes, idioms, and properties, which naturally leads us to the next chapter, which is, well, why then use the language of energia at all? Why talk about these as energies if energies in the Aristotelian sense are actualities or activities? And this was, again, yet another revelation. Why talk about these seemingly scholastic, abstract categories of divine attributes or divine properties as activities, actualities, or operations? I won't give too much away. I'll let you enjoy the chapter. And then the remaining chapters simply look at the distinction itself, the metaphysical arguments, the theological arguments for differentiating between ousia, essence or nature on the one hand, and energies, powers, attributes on the other hand. One of the things that I don't do, in case you're interested in this, is litigate some of the most burning issues like the patristic antecedents of the essence energies distinction, or litigate the compatibility between St. Gregory Palamas and scholastic theories. I wanted to make sure that we laid the groundwork that sort of work could be based on. We can now, I believe, I hope, move forward to talking about those things now that we have a better sense of what the essence energies distinction is in Palamas on its own terms. so these would be sort of second level studies that could be done, and I hope I've contributed to those kinds of discussions as well. But in that vein, I think the last chapters on divine unity, divine simplicity, and the parallels or the links between the essence energies distinction and the doctrine of the Trinity are very useful in that regard. I think people will find those very interesting. There's some of the deepest metaphysical detail and insight from St. Gregory's writings come through in those chapters, things that were phenomenal finds for me to see the level of detail in which he talks about essential differences, the problem of participation, the derivation of energia from ousia in God, and things like this. So those are dealt with in the final chapters of the book. So this is basically what the book is doing. I hope that it's been a step forward in outlining what St. Gregory Palamas himself contributes to this 14th century discussion, because as I've said now a number of times, my main interest is in moving the conversation forward, looking at the history of late Byzantine theology in greater detail, bringing in many of the other figures who worked in the late Paleologan period, but also addressing some of these questions, like the relationship between scholastic theology and Byzantine theology, the reception of patristic concepts and theories in the late Byzantine period, etc. So I'll close my portion of the presentation with that summary, and I'll be happy to take questions about details of the book. Hopefully we don't have to argue about the essence energies distinction here. There's enough of that on the internet, I think, but whatever the questions are, I'll take them.